All right, Joel Gausten here from joelgausten.com. The word legend is used a little too casually these days, in my opinion. However, I cannot think of a better word that applies to my guest. It is my great honor and pleasure to welcome Mr. Chris Spedding. Chris, it's an honor.
Hi,
Thank you for being here.
thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Excellent. And as we were just saying before we began recording, we could very easily do an epic 8 hour interview on your career, which is spanning many decades at this point. Some people had asked me, who's Chris best known for? I said, well, pick an artist because he's probably recorded with them. And that's not an over exaggeration. You've been a solo artist, a session player for well over 50 years at this point. So there
Yeah.
are a lot of directions we could go in. But I wanted to start with this conversation focusing on an album that is brand new. It by the time this video comes out, it'll just have been out for a couple of days. And it's an album called Macon Georgia Giant, which is a collaboration between yourself and a band from Sweden called Diamond Dogs. A very interesting album. What it is a collection of Little Richard tunes. So it's
Yep.
a tribute album to Little Richard, um, which is a unique thing to do in 2025, which is one of the main reasons why I wanted to have you on. So let's start with this current release. As I said, it's a Little Richard tribute album. Little Richard is as ground floor in rock and roll as you're ever going to get. Um, so I want to kind of break it down with a kind of in two directions. Firstly, um, how did the project come about? Whose idea was it to put yourself with Diamond Dogs
Well,
initially?
that would have been Sulo, who's the main mover in Diamond Dogs. I did some stuff with him over in Sweden, about 5 or 6 years ago. Uh, I flew over there, and he has some really great musicians, good bass player and drummer and keyboard player. And Sulo writes these songs, which I guess they hark back to the classic rock period. He's very much into that, like the Faces and stuff like that. And we seemed to hit it off musically. Uh, and I was in Sweden playing with a Swedish band based in Stockholm last fall, uh, and he took advantage of the fact that I was here playing with this other band called Stupidity, which was a strange title for a band, but probably goes over in Sweden. But they're really good. They backed me up on a couple of dates. Sulo took the opportunity, the chance that I happened to be in Sweden, in Stockholm, to say, "Hey, have you got tomorrow night free?" And he'd sort of set all this up. And of course, we don't need to prepare anything because most people, the Little Richard tunes are very basic. They're either a 12 bar or a sort of half familiar, because he's not choosing all the well-known ones, well-known tunes. He's choosing the sort of the B-sides or the little-known ones. But even so, we uh, we had a lot of fun doing it. Great, again, he got a great team of Swedish musicians, and we're doing some a festival in Spain I think in August. I should have looked it up, the actual date, but we are doing a one-off uh, Spanish rock festival in the summer. Let's just say in the summer,
Mhm.
where we're going to play all the tunes. So I'm going to do my homework on this project because, as I say, my involvement was only the one day when we actually recorded it, and it was kind of very free and easy and all that sort of stuff. There's hardly any preparation. Sulo had obviously prepared it and chosen the tunes and lyrics, and he was singing on it. It is a pretty good Little Richard imitation. So, and you say you've heard it, right?
Oh, I love it. I love it.
Yeah. Okay, I must familiarize myself with it. Yeah. So that's the story of that. It's just like a nice day's work in a studio um, on one of those freezing Stockholm days in last fall. Really, really, even it was even cold for the Swedish. They were even complaining.
Wow. Now, from what I understand, this album was recorded live with no rehearsal beforehand. Is that correct?
That's right. No preparation or rehearsal. Oh, let's do this one, and I think they played the original, and we sort of said, okay, we're going to do it in this key. We'll do. I'll take a solo. There was another guitar player on the. We used to sort of split the leads together. Uh, he would take a solo, I'd take a solo, and there's a keyboard player as well. Uh, I don't want to tell you stuff that I'm half remembering and I've got it all wrong, but that's my recollection anyway.
Hmm. I really love the sound of the album because it
Okay.
sounds like something that could have been recorded years ago. It doesn't have that, in my opinion, sometimes overly pristine 2025 production where it's all Pro Tooled and tweaked and pasted
Yeah.
together. It sounds like what it is, you know.
I know what you mean. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. But that's really down to Sulo. We're using Pro Tools and all the digital equipment, but we're not doing like auto tune and doing all those things that you do with digital technology. We're sort of just doing it as we would have done it with analog tape, with a mono tape, straight to mono. That's how we played it. And of course, the digital uh, Pro Tools technology just picked it up like that, and which where the digital technology spoils it for people is when you start doing the auto tune and the editing and the dropping in and the retakes.
Mm.
That's when it starts sounding a bit phony and starts sounding like a current project. So that's why we did that. I like doing that myself. I love the digital technology, but not if you use it like many people use it. I like to it's because it's very um, true to life. It's very they can get the sounds exactly as you're playing them, as long as you don't screw them up. And of course, the trouble with digital technology, you have this great sort of palette of stuff that you can do to it once it's been recorded. If you can resist doing that, then you get a halfway decent recording.
Yeah, absolutely. And you certainly achieved that with this album.
Oh,
Uh,
good.
and Little Richard, like I said just a few moments ago, is one of those originators of, this whole thing that's fueled your life, my life, the lives of millions of people. When was your first exposure to Little Richard's music?
Oh, I can remember getting an EP as I had in those days, like a 45 with two tracks side on it, an extended play. I remember it had Rip It Up, um, Good Golly Miss Molly, uh, Tutti Frutti, and one that I particularly like is Hey, 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 going down to Birmingham, way down in Alabama. Um, that particular one I like with all the flutes in it.
Hmm.
Uh, I love that. I think we might have done a version of Hey, Hey, Hey um, on the Sulo version. But yeah, when I was getting my first Elvis records, this will have been about 1956, 57. And I'll have been about, what, 12 years old.
Hmm.
So very impressionable age. And I had my Little Richard songs, which I like very much. I don't have them. I wish I kept all those. But I move around so much that
Hmm.
you can't pack up all your records and
Right.
even CDs. They're all in the cloud, which Apple keeps charging me for, even though they're I bought them.
I
I
bet.
bought them. I put them in my computer. Now, if I want to play them, I get a bill.
Yeah.
And that's another topic altogether. I don't know why that happens, but yeah. So my collection goes back to my very first records that I ever collected when I was a 12-year-old in 1956. Yeah.
Wow. Fantastic. Fantastic. Little Richard has that timeless quality where, and a wide-reaching effect on people. Little Richard's one of those artists, classic artists, where you don't necessarily, even have to like rock and roll per se. Anybody
Yeah.
can enjoy Little Richard. He's got that classic quality that ties everything together.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
not about talking about subgenre and, oh, I like the Ramones, but I don't like ABBA. There's none of that. Everybody loves Little Richard. You can't avoid
Oh
it.
yeah. 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 I had the pleasure of meeting him once. I actually played on the same record as him. It was for a French artist, Eddie Eddie Mitchell, French singer in the sort of genre of Johnny Hallyday, but Eddie Mitchell was, and he had Little Richard as a guest singer. And so I was in the studio and I played on the track, and I was in the same room as him, as I was able to appreciate being meeting him.
Mm,
Uh, he sang on the song Something Else, the Eddie Cochran song.
mm. Wow.
He sang on that,
Wow.
and so that was a good memory to have. He was getting on a bit. We were talking about 15 years ago uh, when this happened, and when I was living in Los Angeles and doing sessions.
Mm.
So thought I'd drop that in. It actually did
Yeah,
meet.
absolutely. And I'll have to track down that album amongst your literally hundreds of other records you've been a part of.
I can't remember what the album was called, but it's Eddie Mitchell was the spelled as if he was an English person, like Johnny Hallyday is. All these French artists, they'll if they're playing rock and roll, they'll adopt an English sounding name for
Right.
Eddie Mitchell. And Dr. John came and sat in for us on piano at one point. So if you see those credits, Chris Spedding, Dr. John, Little Richard, all on the same record, then that'll probably be the one.
Mm. Yeah, I will certainly look into that. I'd love to check that out for sure, for sure. And speaking of your discography, which is literally endless, I was on your website just going through things and page after page, artist after artist. I can't think of another musician I've encountered who's had that sort of trajectory over the years. So there
Well,
is a
session guys end up if they're on like a fixers list, will end up playing with everybody, even if it's just like 1 3 hour session, and they never even speak to the artist, just play a chart, and then bye bye. So I'm off to my next session now.
yeah,
So it's and then when you later on when you put together all these people, you look in your diary and find out who you actually played with. Sometimes you don't even know who the singer is going to be. Um, like a lot of those Motown musicians, they'll have played on the backing track and they don't know, well, is the lead singer going to be Martha Reeves of the Vandellas or Diana Ross of the Supremes or Smokey Robinson's maybe going to do the lead, or they don't know. They just go in and they play their bit.
yeah,
There's an element of that. Unless you see an artist that you recognize in the studio, you
right,
don't necessarily know.
right. Yeah, it's a bit like being a freelance journalist in a sense. You don't not quite
Yeah,
sure what the assignment's going to be that day, but you take it.
yeah. Or a plumber.
Yeah,
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 you're a professional.
absolutely. Well, one artist that I know you certainly had more than a passing relationship with is someone who, really impacted me growing up. I had a group of friends when I was much younger, and we were sort of discovering records well before the internet, so we would go to record shops or flea markets or what have you, and we'd find records that looked cool, like who's this artist?
Yeah.
And through those journeys, that's one way that we discovered Robert Gordon, who for
Oh,
us was a new sound at the time. We didn't know rockabilly, so that was really the first time we'd heard that style of music. So there's a core group of people I know from where I grew up who loved Robert and still do. Um, I know it's difficult to distill a 40-year working relationship with someone into an answer to a question. But now that Robert's been gone a bit, unfortunately, um, what would you say really most defined him as a performer and as a recording artist?
Well, he was definitely a purist in the rockabilly sense. When I first met him, he said, "Hey, Chris, I sure hope you can play this rockabilly." So I said, "Well, what's rockabilly? We never used the term in England, or basically before the 70s. Rockabilly came the sort of term for the rockabilly revival with the Stray Cats and the Cramps and all those people." So Robert said, "Well, the original Gene Vincent, Eddie Cochran, Scotty Moore stuff." So I said, "Oh, I can do that." I learned guitar playing, copying Scotty Moore riffs. So since from that day, I learned to call it rockabilly. We just used to call it rock and roll
Mm,
or early rock. So that was my introduction to Robert Gordon, who'd obviously come up from the same generation, but his knowledge of all the obscure sort of singles that came out, Jack Scott, stuff, people like that, and uh, he knew all that stuff.
mm,
I only knew the hits. I knew the Rick Nelson stuff, the Gene Vincent stuff, the Eddie Cochran stuff, because Eddie Cochran was much bigger in England than he was in America. Uh, yeah, so that's how I found I realized that what he was calling this really sort of solid genre that he was really wanted to recreate in his music. I knew all about it, but I
mm,
didn't call it rockabilly. It was the stuff that I first, with Little Richard, came in with all that stuff, the very early rock and roll, the early Elvis, Sun Sides, and all that, and especially the guitar player Scotty Moore, who I thought was
mm.
wonderful. So
And
yeah,
very much to Robert's credit, I mean, he built his entire career with a few minor exceptions, but he based his entire career on that sound, and
yeah,
stayed true to that. And he was very much the go-to artist for younger fans like myself. We weren't going to see Little Richard, most likely, but we'd go see Robert Gordon. He was
yeah.
our representative in a lot of ways.
Well, he managed to hook up with Link Ray, which was a brilliant move because no people like me, I'd heard of Link Ray, and for him to have hooked up with him when he made his first impact was brilliant. Uh, and I was very lucky to have followed in his footsteps for when Link parted company with Robert.
Mm.
I was very lucky to be to get that gig.
Yeah.
That got me into New York. So that's when I stopped living and working in the UK. I went to New York to work with Robert, basically, because I think Link was doing a song of mine, Wild Wild Women. He was doing that with Robert.
Mm.
And so Richard Gotterer, Robert's producer, called me up in the UK, say, "Hey, do you want to come and help us record this since you wrote it with Link and Robert?" So I said, "Fantastic. It'd be a great way for me to get into working in New York," which I thought was a great move for me. And I said, "Sure." And I got another call the following day saying, "Well, to tell you the truth, Link's thinking of splitting from Robert, so there's a gig there if you want to do it as a guitar player." So I thought, even better, my lucky day, you know. So that's how that happened. There was uh, uh, a few lucky serendipitous coincidences got me that gig.
Mm. Mm. And of
But
course,
we never recorded that song. We never recorded that song of mine, but recorded lots of other stuff.
mm. And serendipity fuels so many things in the music industry.
Oh yeah,
The big trick is being in the room, no matter where that room happens to be. Just be
yeah,
there. Things will happen.
yeah. They did at that point. Yeah,
As we're talking about sort of the early rock and roll, Little Richard, even the history that Robert embraced musically, which was an older style in many ways, kind of leads me to another artist I know you worked with. And I specifically wanted to bring this up because I've always maintained a belief that the Sex Pistols were a much better band than they're given credit for. I actually heard the Bollocks record after I had heard Little Richard, after I had heard Chuck Berry. So when I listen to Steve Jones guitar playing on that album as a younger man, I'm thinking, oh, this is a Chuck Berry record. You
All
know,
right.
this is a Little Richard record. So there was a musicality in that band that I think is overlooked. I mentioned that obviously because you had produced their first demo in '76 when the band was first starting.
Yeah.
Um, uh, you're probably the only person I can speak to besides them who could offer perspective. I mean, how well along were they as far as understanding
Well,
musicianship and the influences that were coming through?
um, yeah. I'll give a shout out here to Chrissy Hines because she's the person that called me up and said, "Hey, Chris, you got to come see this band at the 100 Club." Because Chrissy, she knew Vivian and Malcolm. She used to work at the shop, and I knew Chrissy long before the Pretenders. This would have been about 1950s, 1976. So I went along there, and it wasn't that packed. They were very aggressive, and the few people that were there, that some of them drifted off. So there were 15 people in the audience, or about like six by the time they finished, and because they used to frighten people. This is before they were well known at all. They weren't known at all. I was quite very impressed by Johnny Rotten, as I knew him, and very impressed by Steve Jones because he seemed to break most of the strings on his guitar and he was still in tune.
Mm,
And I thought, well, if you're going to play this music, I can't think of a more effective way of playing. And I've been playing 20 years. Steve Jones had been playing about 1 year. So he had it down. He knew exactly what he wanted to do, and he did it really, really well. So, and I thought, well, nobody's going to come and see this band. People are frightened off by them. No wonder they're not doing anything. They're playing to 15 people in the 100 Club. So I said to Malcolm McLaren, so I said, the current wisdom in the music business is if you can put together a demo of three songs, three of your best songs, and take it to a record company, they'll listen to that and they might give you a deal. That is what I can do for you. And I found a studio that was cheap. I made Malcolm and Crown come up with the cash, which was my first mistake because I didn't want Malcolm McLaren, who seemed like a bit of an opportunist. So I'm not going to get stuck with the bill for this studio. So I made Malcolm McLaren. You're going to come up with well, it wasn't expensive. It can't be more than a couple of £100 for the whole day. If I'd have paid the bill, I would have owned the tapes.
right.
So that's my first bit. I should have. I thought I was being really smart, but I wasn't smart enough. Anyway, that's a little humorous aside. But they were as good as gold. They came in the studio. We were all set up by about 11 o'clock. By about 5 o'clock that same afternoon, we'd finished three songs,
Mm,
and it basically got them the deal with EMI. Uh, got them. We got people to listen to them. Um, I would meet people in the bar that were journalists for the Melody Maker and New Musical Express, and they would say, "Hey, Chris, you've got to be careful of your reputation because you've got a reputation in this business, and your name is associated with the Sex Pistols." So I said, "Well, what's the problem?" I said, "Well, they're terrible." So I said, "Well, that's interesting. Each to his own. When did you hear them?" "Oh, I
mm.
haven't heard them, but they're terrible." So I thought, this is a wide open opportunity. I walked straight in and said, "I can do something here," and I did. So it was very satisfying, very satisfying. Um, and yeah, good luck to them. I'm still on good terms with them all,
Wonderful.
uh, including Glenn Matlock, who unfortunately doesn't feature that much on the Bollocks, but who wrote most of the songs.
Mm, right. Absolutely.
And
And songwriter.
my demos have got him playing the bass, and they sound totally different to the ones with Steve Jones playing the bass
Right.
because it's more of a cohesive rhythm section. I actually prefer listening to that when you can hear the bass and the bass drum and the snare drum all separate instead of having to sort of listen hard.
Mm,
I call the Chris Thomas productions more like guitar soup because it's like lots of guitar overdubs. and the bass is just playing the lowest note of the guitar chord. If it's going along on an E, like the bass is going the same thing.
Right, right.
There's no sort of listening a lot as I did in those days to Motown and Stax and a lot of the R&B records, great records. You can hear the bass and the bass drum. You can hear all those. It's a different concept that they had to. That they liked that sound. It wasn't my taste, but they did play well.
Hmm.
Good
Yeah,
drummer. Walcott's a good drummer,
yeah.
and Den's a good songwriter and bass player.
Yeah, like I said, I think the musicianship gets overlooked, and they're still playing, without John, but they're still
Yeah,
out doing
yeah.
gigs and doing what they do. So, more power to them. I'm almost embarrassed to ask you this question, but I have you here. So I feel remiss if I don't ask it because in the world of music journalism, there's always a lot of myths that get passed on from generation to generation. So please allow me to ask you this. And I'm not going to cut it. This is on the record. You're here. Did you ever record guitar for the Sex Pistols yourself?
No,
Okay.
no, I didn't. I was impressed with Steve Jones, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to work with him, so that it wouldn't have made any sense for me to say, "Oh yeah, this band's got a great guitar player. I'm going to replace all his parts." That would have been like counterintuitive. I
Mm,
was interested in working with this guy who knew how to play the guitar for that very well for that genre. And you don't go to a new young band and say, "Okay, I'm going to produce you, but I'm going to like play all your parts now."
right.
They'd have hated me. um, and I actually, when the rumors first came out about me playing, I think because Chris Thomas was the producer and I'd worked with Chris Thomas, he produced my Hurt album.
Hmm.
Uh, and I'd just been on the road with John Cale, with Chris Thomas was on the keyboards. So I knew I played on a lot of Chris Thomas's productions, like Frankie Miller, people like that. So people assumed that I was Chris Thomas's first call for guitar if we had a project, and Steve Jones's rhythm guitar sound is not unlike my sound at that time. So I thought, oh well, I called up Malcolm McLaren and said, look, if you want to make a joint um, statement to the press saying that that's Steve Jones on the guitar, I'm sure Steve would appreciate it. And Malcolm McLaren's reaction was, nah, can't be bothered. Don't think about it. So he was interested in not interested in any of that at all. The more trashy that people thought the Sex Pistols were, like the Monkees who had to have session guys, or the Bay City Rollers who had to have session guys, he didn't mind.
Mm,
So at that point, I thought that's the last time I think I ever spoke to Malcolm McLaren. I thought, well, I'm not from that little world that he's in, that world of being cute like that.
right.
So that's the end of it. And that's how the rumor grew. And I think Malcolm McLaren cultivated it. Even Steve Jones cultivates it for a joke. God bless him.
Yeah, fantastic player. Even then, even on that
Good rhythm
album.
player. Yeah.
And I
Well,
think,
they did the tracks with Paul Cook, Steve and Paul, bass, guitar and drums, and then he put the bass on afterwards, just echoing the low note of the guitar chord, and that's you gave him that sound. He would overdub guitar, rhythm guitar, and lead guitar. So on my demos, there's a minimum of that. There's no rhythm guitar overdubs. There's just a couple of lead guitar overdubs, which is how I liked it, sort of pared down. He had
right.
such a full sound on the rhythm guitar that you didn't need to double it. But Chris Thomas, being Chris Thomas, he uh, he wanted to get the maximum out of it. He knew what it was. He was a brilliant producer, Chris Thomas, and of my albums, the one that he produced, the Hurt album, is the best sounding one that I ever did, better than the ones that Mickey Most did, sound wise. So good on Chris Thomas and Steve Jones, the whole lot of them. They deserve their. place in music history.
Mm.
I believe.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And there's a reason why that record still holds up. The songs are
Oh
there.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know, you can grab as many headlines as you want, Malcolm, but the reality is the songs are there. Without the songs,
oh,
there's
yeah,
nothing to care about, you know.
yeah.
As I said earlier, we could very easily do an epic 8 hour conversation. I know neither of our schedules permit that at the moment, but I wanted to conclude with this. You had mentioned listening to Little Richard back in the 50s,
Yeah,
and here we are, 2025, roughly roughly 7 decades later, and
yeah.
you're on an album doing Little Richard. So you've been at this game a very long time, and you've worked with a lot of artists. The music industry isn't particularly welcoming in a lot of ways for people. It's very difficult to stay in it. Um, People become journalists after a few years, So for you, ultimately, what has been the key to this career? What has been your key to maintaining this longevity in, frankly, in many ways, a very savage industry?
Right. Well, I haven't had huge monetary success, and I haven't had failure. I had too much failure. So, I mean, I when I was at school, I was always the guy with the guitar. And of course, there was no in 1956. There was no way you could go to college or music school and learn what it was that I did. I would have to learn classical studies, which I wasn't interested in, even though I played the violin when I was a kid in the school orchestra. So I was kind of limited by the fact that I was good at this one thing that nobody really wanted, the playing that rock and roll, which was going back to the 50s. Rock and roll was like sort of death metal in people's estimation of like good music. It'd be in the 60s with the advent of the Beatles, who all the mums and dads loved. Um, it became more of a respectable past way to earn a living. But in the 50s, you were a bit, it was teddy boys and violence and gangs
Mm,
and bad, bad social behavior. And so I was kind of a bit of a dropout. Um, and so I was only good at the one thing, you know, I was, and the same thing happened later on when I could have maybe dropped out and gone into being an A&R guy or a producer or being a journalist, which I had a couple of goes at doing that just for fun. Um, I was much better at playing the guitar. And fortunately, people used to come and ask me to play the guitar and give me money. So I thought, okay, this is what I wanted to do. I'll stay doing this. So yeah, I was lucky. I was lucky to have been able to survive without any huge success.
mm,
I just had lots of nice jobs to do. We got me great artists and learned a lot. Was able to do my own records when I wanted to, which is where a lot of session guys get a bit bitter. They say they've been on everybody's hit and they can't seem to get one of their own,
mm,
even though they might have contributed to in strong ways to making the hits. Um, I was able to go and in of all studios, the Abbey Road Studios in London, I had to deal with those guys to go and do my own records. So it's kind of humbling in a way because you realize it's not that difficult. It's not, sorry, not that. It's more difficult than you think, is what I wanted to say. More difficult than you think to make that hit record. A lot of things have got to be in play. You've got to have the distribution, you've got to have the plugging that you get it on the radio, you've got to have a record heard, you've got to, lots of things have got to be in play. Um, so again, I was lucky. I lucked out. I was able to cut my teeth as a record maker and producer at Abbey Road with all those wonderful engineers and in that wonderful room that the Beatles used to work in, Studio Two. Uh, I was there in the late 60s, early 70s. Um, And then later on, I was able to work with great producers like Mickey Most. So when I wrote a song that I thought was worthy of being a hit single, I took it to him, and it worked that one time. It worked. So I've been able to experience all that stuff. So again, it's just been very fortunate.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're very fortunate to have the music you worked on over the years, especially this current album. You're doing things relevant and great in the here and now,
Okay.
which I appreciate. And again, the album is called Macon Georgia Giant. It's by Diamond Dogs with Chris Spedding. By the time this video post, the record will be out. I will include links in the video description for people to get the album. And everybody watching this video needs to hear this record. This is a true, pure rock and roll album in 2025, honoring, the guy who really kind of started it all for all of us. So
Yeah.
it's a great listen.
Well, I can't wait to hear it.
Ah, you haven't heard it
But
yet.
I've not heard the finished thing. I just remember the day. I'm
Um,
gonna have, I'm gonna have to do some homework on it because we're gonna have to get on stage and play the thing in the summer in Spain.
yeah,
So
yeah. Ask your publicist, who's a friend of mine. He'll hook you up.
okay.
He'll get you
Yeah,
the.
well, no, I'll have to ask Sulo to send me a link to it. So I'm gonna have to learn the tunes as we. So when he calls a tune, because which one's that? What key? I can have to at least know that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I wish you well with that gig coming up in the summer. I'm sure there'll be some sort of video documentation of it, which I'll keep my eyes out for.
Yeah.
In the meantime, again, I love the album. I love the opportunity that we've had to touch base. Um,
Okay.
we could probably do 10 more of these, but we'll have to see where the future takes us both. But in the meantime, Chris, it's been a pleasure. Thank you again.
Been a pleasure. Thank you very much. Nice talking to you.